This session will be about hostname site collections, something that has been around for, well, quite some years. It already existed in SharePoint 2007, Microsoft has added some very interesting capabilities to it, and now in SharePoint 2013 it became even more interesting. A little disclaimer, it's SharePoint, so lots of things can go wrong during my session. I'm still an on-premises guy, so, well, you know, Hyper-V and everything, so I didn't make I didn't do something for the demo gods this morning, but, well, let's see if it will turn out okay. A little bit about myself. I'm Thomas Vochten. I'm a SharePoint Server MVP based out of Belgium. I'm a speaker, speak at various conferences. I'm a trainer, and I like to fiddle around with SQL Server. That's why I call myself an involuntary DBA. Many people in the SharePoint space are in the same role as me, I guess. So SharePoint administrators, many people administer their SQL service too. So that's what I like to do also. I'm a fairly active Twitterer, so if you want to ask questions afterwards or anything, don't hesitate to ping me on Twitter, or you can send me an email if you want. I've got a blog, but it's more an announcements platform for my public speaking activities than there is real interesting technical content, but you might never know, so okay. I'm also a board member of the Belgian SharePoint user group, and I work for Xylus, and that's a consulting company based in Antwerp in Belgium. All right, so this is going to be a level, well, I called it a level 250 session, something between 200 and 300, because, well, when we're talking about SharePoint and hostname site collections, there are a lot of concepts that you need to be aware of, and it depends on your experience with SharePoint if those concepts are already clear. So I will explain some basics for people that are starting out in SharePoint. We're going to talk about the problem space, because hostname site collections try to solve a problem. That's what we're going to do first. And then we're going to talk about the relationship between SharePoint and IAS, which is, well, problematic sometimes. We'll talk a bit about web applications, application pools, how you can use them to design your farm. We'll talk about a sort of new blueprint that might be your next architecture when designing a new SharePoint farm. And then, finally, we're going to talk about hostname site collections and how they might solve particular problems that you are facing today. Okay, but what is the problem? If you're a SharePoint consultant like me, I meet a lot of customers, a lot of SharePoint environments, and, well, many people are a bit frustrated and by all kinds of problems that they themselves created or SharePoint created for them. So what are the things that I see in the wild that, well, annoy me or annoy my customers? A few weeks ago, I met a farm at a customer, and, well, I was asking the normal questions. There was a problem, so what is the performance, and et cetera, et cetera. I had a look at the SQL Server, and I thought this farm was built 5 years ago, but it was only built 2 months ago. So just to paint a picture here, we've got a lot of problems with undocumented installations, a lot of garbage on the systems, on the system drive, scripts, tools, installation media lying around somewhere. So that's not really what we want. No monitoring whatsoever, also a very common problem. But I must warn you, hostname site collections won't solve this problem, right? No monitoring, that's something that you have to set up. Dubious configurations, that ties into the subject of this presentation a lot. Admins just hacking around, you know, and it all ends in miserable performance. Okay, so the main mantra for this presentation should be keep it simple. And that is what we are going to try to do today, coming up with an architecture, a kind of blueprint on how you can make your next SharePoint farm simpler and more easy to manage. So these are the usual buzzwords that we need. Simplicity, that's the main one, I guess. Predictability, scalability, portability even, compatibility and supportability. Those are the goals that we have to adhere to. Okay, about SharePoint and IAS. That's a very interesting relationship, right? When you create a web application in SharePoint, the same old VB script that was used in SharePoint 2003 that has not changed, is still used today to create a new website, if you create a new web application. That already says something, I guess. So they have a rather problematic relationship. SharePoint can't live without IAS, and well, IAS, well, you need IAS if you want a SharePoint installation. So they're living apart together. That's a nice relationship. But the problem is, SharePoint needs IAS, but SharePoint doesn't really care about IAS. Well, you create a web application, then your IAS website is instantiated. Well, all goes fine for the basic scenarios. You probably know about extending and de-extending websites and how that works. But there are other things that are not really, well, supported by SharePoint. Certificates, that's the main one, I guess. So you create a new web application, you say, okay, we want to do an HTTPS, we want an SSL secured website. And well, SharePoint, there is no way in SharePoint to provide a certificate for your IAS website. The same goes for host headers. When you initially create your web application, you can specify a host header. But afterwards, if you want to change something, you have to de-extend the website and then extend it again to include the host header if you want that. So that's all a bit problematic. Advanced bindings, you could have multiple bindings for a specific website. I'm not saying that's a good idea, but you could do that, but not within SharePoint. Multiple IP addresses. If you've got multiple web applications and you want them to listen on multiple IP addresses, there is no way in SharePoint to configure that. You need to reside to other tools and technologies to have what you want. And of course, as always with SharePoint, PowerShell is our savior, PowerShell to the rescue. All these tasks, so signing certificates, having multiple IP addresses, etc., you can use, or you can do that with PowerShell, but not with SharePoint. Okay, a very quick, well, some basics about the relationship between web applications and websites. A web application in SharePoint is just a logical concept. So it's just a concept of, it's a boundary of settings, of security, of customizations, etc. So it's logical. And then we've got a website in IAS, which is a physical concept. And there is a one-to-many relationship between a web application and a website. So you can have one web application and have multiple websites. You can have 5. That is basics that probably everyone is aware of. And does anyone know how many web applications we can create in a farm, or we are supposed to create in a farm, or not supposed to create in a farm? What is the maximum that is supported? 10, yes. No. Yeah, well, 10, I think in SharePoint 2007 you could even create 100 web applications. Now you can create more than 20 web applications, that's no problem. Physically that's possible. But it's more of a threshold. So if you pass the 20 web applications mark, you're no longer supported, okay, but you might have some other problems too. Try, for example, deploying a solution to more than 20 web applications. That will take some time, I guess. That's not always what we want. Then the next concept that we have to talk about is the application pool. That's probably even more important, especially for performance. So an application pool is also a physical concept. The infamous worker process, it's used, it's the process for your website, so it's CPU and memory, and it holds the identity of your web application. I think that's fairly self-evident. And there is also a one-to-many relationship between an application pool and an IAS website. So you've got one application pool, and you can use it to serve multiple IAS websites. Okay, the quiz continues. How many application pools can you create in a farm to be supported? 5? 10. That was the 10 that you're probably, yeah, that you probably remembered. Yes, yeah.
Why it is 10? Because it's really rare when they have several applications and one application.
That's true. When I go to customers, especially customers that are doing SharePoint 2007, and I must admit I've been guilty to this rule too. When I was starting out in SharePoint, out in SharePoint, I probably created, well, too many web applications and too many application pools, like probably we all did some years ago, but we shouldn't do that anymore. A few months ago, I met a customer who had 35 application pools and 35 web applications, so a one-to-one relationship between those two. was very, very interesting, and it was a single server farm. So, and to my surprise, it still worked. It was running, and there was not really a performance problem. Yeah. Sorry? I don't remember. Yeah. It was not that. No, it was not that powerful. It was, I don't know, 16 gigabytes of RAM, something. Yeah. The memory pressure was fairly high, though. Yeah. But it kept running. Okay, so 10 application pools in a farm. But the problem is that out of the box, when you install SharePoint, you already have 4. Central administration uses one. And, well, the SharePoint Web Services root is a special one. It's not really, it's not really used. And now we've got the security token service application pool and the one with the GUID. I don't understand why SharePoint has nice names for 3 or 4 central application pools and then a GUID for the other one. And the last one is the application discovery, a load balancer service application that manages the connection, that manages a topology in your farm so that your farm knows which service applications are active and how to route requests for service applications to them. That's the random GUID application pool in our farm. And then, when we install SharePoint, we usually create 2 additional application pools, or more. We've got services application pools and content application pools. A services application pool can be created via PowerShell with new SP service application pool. A content application pool cannot be created in PowerShell directly. It's instantiated or created when you create a new web application. So, service application pools, content application pools. Again, the question, how many of these do you create? Probably not as much as my customer that I just mentioned, who had 35 of them. Many people create a web application and then a matching content application pool. And that's not really always what you want. Same goes for service application pools. I've seen many occasions where every service application has its own application pool. You could do that. Be aware of the 10 application pool limit, however. But it's not necessarily a good idea. If you've got very strict security requirements, then it could be possible that you have to, and then you have to find a solution to this. But as a general rule, don't instantiate. Well, I always instantiate just one services application pool and one content application pool. Many people like to create one extra for search. I don't do that, but you could do that. Okay. But what the business wants, or many business, especially the communications and the marketing department, they really like this stuff. They want a unique URL for every site collection. And what we did in the past was just creating multiple web applications. We want portal.contoso.com, we want intranet.contoso.com, we want other web applications with other websites, or the site collections with unique URLs. And the only thing that we could do is create many, many web applications, and then you end up with 35 of them. So that's traditionally what we used. And we also used something called a host header, so that IAS was able to differentiate where to route your request to. So your request for portal.contoso.com arrives at IAS. IAS looks in its table of host headers, and then it routes it to the right web application. It works, but it's not really scalable. And that's more or less the problem. Because if you want to create multiple site collections with unique URLs, if you want to be within support limits, you could only create 20 of them. And again, 20 is just too much, in my opinion. So, and if you want to use multiple host headers, well, that was the only way that you could do it. And there are all kinds of problems when publishing. Alternate access mappings, everyone loves them, especially when you're starting out with SharePoint. Probably everyone who installed a farm a few years ago or does it for the first time wonders, internal URL, public URL, how does this work? I remember that I struggled with it for a few months probably, before you really get the concept of those alternate access mappings, especially the relationship between alternate access mappings and zones and websites, because some people create additional alternate access mappings, but don't create or don't extend their web application to a new website, which you should probably do. So it's all a big mess. It's not easy. It's not, well, really convenient. Okay, so that's why I want to introduce you to a sort of new architecture. It's not new, but something to think about, and that's where hostname site collections come into play. So the design principles, it starts with a single farm. Now that in itself is for some companies a revolution. I don't know, well, in the United States it's not that popular, but I know that in Europe and in the UK, a few years ago, if you went to Microsoft Services and you engaged them and you said, well, we want to design a SharePoint farm, and you're not a small company, you're a bigger company, you always ended up with multiple farms. You had a services farm for search, and you had multiple content farms. But that worked all right for most of the basic scenarios, but if you did things like, let's say, ADFS and custom claims providers, if you know what that is, it can become a horrible mess. It's not really easy. That's why many people, including myself, now think that we should try to have a single farm for everything. You might think, well, how does that scale? Well, you just add more web servers or more application servers. There are a lot of topologies that you can use nowadays. But single farm is very important for me. I'm not too fond about service application farms or services farms anymore because, well, they make life complicated. Well, they're still valid, and there are, of course, use cases where you can deploy a services farm, but I don't like them anymore. In the single farm, we create one single content application pool and one single web application. So just one web application and one application pool. And in this web application, we put all our sites. So our internet sites, our publishing site, everything. Now my sites, I still call them my sites. I don't know what you do. I like the word my site. I suppose they're OneDrive for Business sites now, even on premises. But I put everything in one single content web application. Scenarios in where you would still want to have multiple web applications could be if you're, well, let's say for security reasons, or there is one web application that heavily relies on some custom code that you don't really trust. We all trust our developers, of course, but you know, there are still some reasons to have multiple web applications. Sorry? Yeah, or policies for security, or yeah, that's still valid. But I try to stay with these as long as possible. And then a single services application pool, even for search. If you look at those application pools, those services application pools, it's basically hosting WCF services. It's not really doing something, well, active. And if you really want to scale, you add more application servers, and the application load balancer service will make sure that it will all scale, at least in theory. So all the service applications share the same application pool. I also use this, the account that is running the application pool for the search services, the physical ones, so the host controller and the node runner processor. I always use the same accounts for all these application pools and services. But again, like always, if you've got valid business reason not to do so, security being the main one, of course you don't have to do this. My graphics design skills are pretty lousy, but that's more or less how it looks. So the light blue ones are the ones I created out of the box, and the dark blue ones are the one that we create. So I've got one single content application pool with multiple sites in them, and one services application pool for my service applications. Okay, about this content web application. Another thing is SSL. Many people still don't use SSL, don't like to use SSL, but especially in SharePoint 2013, I guess that you can't really live without SSL anymore, especially because of all the external applications like Office Web Applications, who, well, if you don't use SSL everywhere throughout the complete SharePoint technology stack, then you can just read your Office documents on the wire if you want to, or in the Office 365, Office Web Application logs. So just use SSL. Now, I must admit, using SSL does not prevent you from seeing information about your documents in the logs, but still, Using SSL, especially with the app model and everything, and the provider-hosted apps, the SharePoint-hosted apps, using SSL should be a requirement in my opinion. But still, many people don't like it because it's not easy to manage, to create, and especially with hostname site collections, as we will see, it's a bit of, well, there are some tricks that you have to know. When we deploy all site collections in the same content web application, well, used hostname site collections becomes a very attractive option, as we will see during the demo. So I also have the OneDrive for Business site collections in the content web application, and we can scale this by adding more web servers. If you want to use SharePoint hosted apps, you might know that you have to configure a bit of extra infrastructure. You need a DNS domain, a separate one. You need to create an SSL certificate for it. You need to make sure that you're creating a wildcard DNS record so that your app requests are routed to your SharePoint farm. But even in this scenario, you can use SharePoint hosted apps. You don't have to do extra stuff. If you have an existing SharePoint farm that uses host headers, you might want to create, or you might have to create, an apps web application. That's an empty web application in SharePoint that is created without a host header, just to accommodate the requests for the SharePoint apps. You know, if you open a SharePoint app, a SharePoint hosted app that is, in SharePoint, you get this funky URL, something like guid. And then the extra domain, contosoapps.com, for example. And well, the request for that domain, they have to end up in SharePoint somehow. So if you're using a web application with a host header, well, the host header does not match the requested URL for your SharePoint app. So then you might have to create an optional web application without a host header so that SharePoint can examine these requests and do something useful with it. If you're using an apps web application, you might need an SSL certificate. You always need an SSL certificate. And that can be a wildcard or a SAN certificate. I'm going to talk about SAN certificates. Who was in Spence Harbor's session? So most of you know what a SAN certificate is probably now. But I will show you in the demo. Now, much of these things that I just talked about are also reflected in something that is called the product line architecture. Don't worry, it's not something you missed. It's not something that you can download from TechNet, or it's not a nice Visio diagram. It's an offering from Microsoft Services. I'm not saying it's the best offering, but it reflects much of the philosophy that I'm talking about right now. So it's some guidance, because Microsoft Services realized a few years ago that, well, many people thought, well, SharePoint is crap, the performance is not good, and well, it's not really SharePoint's problem. It's how you operate it, and how you administrate it, and how you architect it. That's why they came up with a product line architecture. They've got a product line architecture for multiple products, but also for SharePoint. So it's very prescriptive, a very strict guidance on how you should create your farm. It's relatively easy to implement. It comes with a bunch of scripts that you can use to set up a farm according to the principles that I just explained to you. But you can only get it through Microsoft Services, and I don't believe it's very cheap. Well, it's Microsoft Services, right? So if you ever hear the product line architecture, then you know what we are talking about. Before we're going to talk about hostname site collections, I'm going to quickly show you how my demo environment looks like. My demo environment is already set up to use hostname site collections. We're going to create additional ones in a few minutes. But then you just have an idea how that looks like. Let's go to my SharePoint server. Now, we'll start out in IAS. What I did before I installed SharePoint is I deleted the default website. I don't like it to be there. I like platform hygiene, like Spence calls it. What we don't need, we delete it. Now, granted, some third-party applications don't like the default website to be deleted. In my opinion, those are then bad, well, third-party programs, but okay. I'd like to delete the default website. Many people just stop it. That's also valid. And I also deleted all the additional application pools that we have when we install IAS, because we don't need them in SharePoint. SharePoint creates its own application pools. If we need another one, we can just recreate it. Okay, so let's look at our websites. We've got the two obvious ones, Central Administration and SharePoint Web Services. And then we've got our single web application, like I explained. If we go to the Bindings tab, you will see that we're not using a host header. It's empty. So every request for port 443 that arrives at my server will end up in this web application. And because we're not using a host header, we can use hostname site collections, which have a unique URL per site collection, and we can also use apps. Now, these apps, they use, like I said, a specific URL, which should be different from the URL that you use for your normal site collections to avoid cross-site scripting attacks. And that's why I created the SAN certificate. And for the ones that were not in Spencer's session, what is special about a SAN certificate is that it's a certificate with multiple subjects. You can create one in your lab, or you can order one online. It's not very cheap to do so. And I went a bit to the extreme here, because in my SAN certificate, I've got 2 wildcards. Not every internet certificate vendor or CA likes this. Of course, wildcard certificates, it's not always valid for every option, but what you could do alternatively, if you don't like a wildcard certificate for your complete domain, like I did, my domain is thvo.net, you could, for example, create a subdomain especially for SharePoint, something like sharepoint.contoso.com, and then create a wildcard certificate star.sharepoint.contoso.com to limit the attack surface. But this is a lab environment, so I don't really care. So I've got one for star.domain.net and one for my apps. The SF01 that you will see during my demos, it comes again during the other demos. That's just SharePoint Farm 01 because I've got multiple farms. So that means that every request for thvo.net or SF01 thvoapps.net, that's my app domain, will end up in the same web application. If I would have a host header here, my hostname site collections wouldn't work, and the requests for my apps wouldn't work either, because, well, there is no way to determine where they should end up. If you really need a host header, you can always create a second web application and then create a specific certificates only for your SharePoint hosted apps. All right. That was just a quick tour. Let's talk about the hostname site collections. So, living without host headers. Again, a disclaimer. It's not because this is on TechNet. Hostname site collections are the preferred method to deploy sites in SharePoint 2013. That's what is on TechNet. It depends. I know it's a consultant's answer, but it depends on your situation. It's not because they say this on TechNet that you have to deploy hostname site collections, of course. We will look at the drawbacks of hostname site collections in a few minutes. Now, before we talk about hostname site collections, we have to know what we used to do, and those are path-based site collections, sorry. So, path-based site collections are the traditional way of addressing in SharePoint. That means you've got a web application, and a web application determines the URL. Everything that comes after the URL is a site collection or a managed path, but the main URL for all site collections is determined by the web application. You could only have one unless you created multiple zones. The advantage is that it's well known. It has been around for, well, forever, basically. So everyone knows about it. One of the disadvantages of hostname site collections is if you create them and you've got a consultant coming in that does not know about hostname site collections, they're going to be confused because it's not a well-known approach. Like I said, the URL is determined by the web application, and every site collection has a unique path through the use of managed paths. And that's also the way you scale, wildcard managed paths like /sites, and then you can create multiple site collections underneath the same web application to scale. And it uses zones and the infamous alternate access mappings that we already talked about to have multiple URLs or to have multiple authentication mechanisms and to do publishing through reverse proxies or load balancing. So that's a very well-known approach. Hostname site collections, well, the better way, like I said, it depends. I think it's very flexible, but some people really hate it, but okay. The basic principle is that you have a unique DNS name for every site collection. So, and those names can be completely different. So it could be www.microsoft.com, www.combinedknowledge.com, all in the same web application. They don't have to look, they don't have to have the same domain root. Now, of course, like we will see in the demonstration, it's very easy to have sites if they have the same domain roots. You can still have managed paths. So we can still use them to, well, not to scale, but to create some kind of structure. So portal.contoso.com/site/site A. But it's more used to create structure than scale. If you go to TechNet, I call this architecture because it's a horrible diagram. There are some, well, some not very good practices, like the name of this web application is a server name, something you should not do probably. But underneath this web application, we've got multiple site collections with unique names. Intranet.contoso.com, teams.contoso.com, my.contoso.com for the my sites, and then multiple site collections with managed paths. Now, there is a problem with hostname site collections. The problem is both the documentation on TechNet and the PowerShell commands. Because we've seen, well, there's a lot of confusion. We've seen host named site collections. We've talked about host headers. Some people are a bit confused between the name host header, host names. And the problem is it's not only confusing, it's also incompatible with each other. So that's all fine. But even in the PowerShell commands to create a new site collection, a host name site collection, they use the term host header web application. And it's especially, well, it's painful because it should be a web application without a host header. So, well, that's what we have to live with. So we see references to host headers everywhere and we shouldn't be using them. So a bit painful. Also for the managed paths, there is a reference to a host header. Well, that's very unfortunate. Okay, why should we use them? Office 365 uses them. Now, I'm not saying that using hostname site collections makes it easier for you to migrate to Office 365. I don't see any valid reason why that would be better for your migration, personally. That's also on TechNet, that it enables you to migrate to Office 365 more easily. I don't know why. It's just a bunch of site collections. If you're thinking about, well, if you're using hostname site collections and we're using apps, because if you use a farm solution, then the farm solution will be visible in all site collections, and those site collections can belong to different departments. Well, if you use the philosophy, okay, we're not using sites farm solutions anymore, then I could see why this is probably valid. But personally, I don't see any reason why that is the case. Now, what is the case is that it's best tested. Microsoft uses Office 365 extensively. They've gained a lot of experience through operating a large-scale SharePoint farm. So many of the new SharePoint features, and I guess new SharePoint features in the next version too, they will work best with hostname site collections because they're best tested. Microsoft tests everything with hostname site collections in Office 365, so we can probably assume that this will be the best tested scenario. Additionally, some features in SharePoint expect that you use hostname site collections, like request management. Now, we know no one uses request management, or not many people use it, but if you use it, you have to use hostname site collections or it just doesn't work. And it's, well, very scalable because we're not limited to the 20 web applications anymore if you want to have multiple URLs. Now, creating hostname site collections is very easy. First, you create a web application without a host header, like we said. Otherwise, it all breaks down. So a web application without a host header. Again, this is where SharePoint does not really help. If you already have another one without a host header and you want to create another web application without a host header, SharePoint will say, oh, we have got a binding conflict. So that's where you can, for example, fill in a host header in SharePoint let it deploy a website, and then manually remove the host header from the site and assign a different IP address, something like that. There are all kinds of workarounds possible, but you should create a web application without a host header. And then you have to create a root site collection. This root site collection has to be there. It has to be a path-based site collection, not a hostname site collection. And it's there for supportability, because every web application, you need a root site collection to be supported, and also for search. What is very nice is that even if you have, well, thousands of hostname site collections in your web application, if you create a web application with a root site collection, which might be empty, then your search service will automatically determine all the other site collections. You don't have to fill them in the content sources in your search application. So always create a root site collection. And then you create site collections with PowerShell, because you can't create hostname site collections in central administration by default. That's also very important. Okay, so that's how that goes. So new SP sites, but it's basically the same command as we are used to, except for the unfortunate host header web application parameter. If you use this one, then it will create a hostname site collection in this web application. Like you see, it's not a server name. It's, in this case, it's content.contoso.com. That is the site, the root site collection, or that determines the web application that is not used by the users. So that's all very simple. Okay, let's see how that goes. So I'm not going to bore you with creating a web application. That would take too much time, so I already created one. So what you do when you create your web application, it's the usual PowerShell command, but you don't use the host header parameter, because we want to create one without. So it's just new SP web application, nothing special, nothing exotic, nothing fancy here. Then we create an empty root site collection, just new SP site. You don't have to specify a template. You don't even have to serve to it. You don't have to even include it in DNS. It's not needed. Just create a new site collection. And you see, we don't specify the host header web application parameter here, because we want to create a path-based site collection as a root site collection. What we then do is we enable self-service site creation, and that's for the My Sites. If you have additional requirements for self-service site creation, you have to develop a custom site creation mechanism. That is possible. But the out-of-the-box one still works for My Sites, but it does not work for other sites. So if you're using self-service site creation for other site collections than your My Sites, you might have to go to your developers. But creating My Sites by the users is still possible. This is an example of a managed path. We're going to talk about managed paths in a few minutes. So we can create a special managed path for our hostname site collections through the host header parameter. Then it will be available for the hostname site collections. We create a My Site host, something you usually do, well, you have to do to have My Sites. Nothing special here, except for the host header web application parameter to make the My Site host also a hostname site collection. Now, if you want to know what type of site collections you have, there is a parameter that you can query. Host header is site name, and that's a property of every site collection. Let me quickly run that. Okay, I added some color coding. So you see, I've already created some hostname site collections. The red ones are path-based site collections, so that's the root site collection is in red. And the second one is one we are going to migrate, because we are going to look at migrating to hostname site collections too. And the green ones are hostname site collections. So you see, they all have unique URLs. The app catalog, community site, content type hub even. I created everything with a hostname site collection, and I've got 2 My Sites as well. You see that I created all my site collections in the same domain namespace. They're all created in thvo.net. That's because it's convenient for my certificate, of course. Okay, If we're now going to create a hostname site collection, a new one, I specify the URL, evoconf, a name, an alias, and this is the important bit, host header web application. So we tell SharePoint where to put my hostname site collection, and we use a template. That's all there is to it. Now, if you don't like using PowerShell, well, you should if you're in this track, but still there might be possibilities to have something else. And there are some interesting solutions, custom solutions, for example, on Codeplex. You've got a few farm solutions that you can download so your users can, or your administrators can create hostname site collections in central administration. I've got an example right here. If you go to application management, and I already installed the custom solution, I've got a create hostname site collection here. That is not there by default. And if you click it, you can just create a hostname site collection from the user interface, and you can specify any URL you want. Now, you can specify any URL you want, but you have to make sure, of course, that it matches your certificate, that you created in DNS, that you created in your load balancer, et cetera, et cetera. So it looks easy, and it is probably easy, but don't forget the technical context in which you're working. We will come back to that too. So creating hostname site collections, very simple, through PowerShell or through a custom solution. Okay, if we compare hostname site collections with path-based site collections, so the traditional approach with the new approach, or the alternative approach, I should say, site creation through PowerShell in hostname site collections. If you're using the out-of-the-box self-service site creation for your normal sites, you should develop a custom self-service site creation provider. We can have unique URLs per site collection. We can even have multiple unique URLs per site collection. We will get to that. So we don't use alternate access mappings anymore. Yay. We all hated them, right? If we create managed paths, because that is still possible, we have to create them at the farm level. Traditionally, if you created a managed path, it was a managed path tied to a web application. You said new SP managed path, and then you chose a web application, and that managed path, like, for example, sites or personal or projects or whatever, was tied to that specific web application. With hostname site collections, you can only create managed paths at the farm level. That means that there is a supportability, or there's a threshold limit of 20 managed paths per farm, maximum, because after that, performance starts to decrease. That means that you can have a maximum of 20 different managed paths across all your site collections, hostname site collections. So think about which managed paths you create. I always try to stick with the default, like sites or projects or teams, some 4 or 5 maximum for performance. Something else that we have not talked about is if you've got multiple web applications and you've got a different SLA for your My Sites, for example, in a traditional approach, your My Sites ended up in a My Sites content database. But with this approach, because we've got only one web application, sites end up in all databases that you have. If you have a web application with 20 databases, well, the My Sites will get mixed with the normal sites. That might not want what you want. Therefore, you can create a custom site creation provider which determines if it's a My Site, put it in that database, for example, something like that. It's also a farm solution, but that is possible. There is a nice blog post by Victor Villen who explains how you can do that. Okay, now, if you want to have multiple URLs per site, for example, for publishing purposes, and by publishing I mean reverse proxies, publishing to the internet, traditionally you can have up to 5 different URLs because we have 5 different zones. You can use them, but the disadvantage is that it's valid for all site collections. So if you had a one web application with 5 URLs, all your site collections would be reachable through these 5 base URLs. With hostname site collections, you can have up to 5 URLs per site collection, but still 5 because they are still tied to zones. So you can have an intranet.contoso.com as a site collection, and then have an extranet.contoso.com as a secondary URL to that same site collection. And that's how you do this. There are different PowerShell commands to enable this scenario. Set SP site URL, remove SP site URL, and get SP site URL. Underneath, you see we have an intranet.contoso.com, and then we have set SP site URL, and then we add the new URL, extranet.contoso.com, and we still tie it to a specific zone. That's something you have to do. Using these zones also enables you to use custom authentication, for example, for specific URLs, for specific site collections. So zones are still available, not only for authentication, also for protocol, HTTP, HTTPS, or for different user policies, like you said. That is still possible. And they will be consistent for all site collections. And like I said, alternate access mappings are not used. Managed paths are still available, so that's nice. And you also set them at the farm level, as we saw in the demonstration. And if you create a managed path, for example, projects, it will be available for all site collections, for all hostname site collections. Okay, certificates. Because we're using multiple sites with multiple URLs, well, those sites have to match the contents of the subject of our certificates. So you can use a wildcard certificate, or you could use a SAN certificate. I like SAN certificates, but be careful. It's not because you're using SAN certificates that you can choose any URL you like, because, well, if you've got Microsoft.com, combinedknowledge.com, Google.com, let's say something, you have to manage your SAN certificate and renew it with a new URL every time you create a new site collection. That's not really what we want, of course. So try to adhere to a naming standard and try to use the same basic domain, the base domain namespace for all your site collections. That makes your life a lot easier. It's possible to do it other ways, but that's one big mess, I guess. Okay, so if you want to know if a site collection is a hostname site collection, this is the property that you can use. Host header is site name. Now, migrating to hostname site collections, there are two ways, the old way and the new way. This is the old way, the complicated way. So that means you have to back up your site, and you have to restore it as a hostname site collection. If you're using the latest, or almost the latest SharePoint version, SharePoint 2013 that is, the February 2015 cumulative update included a new method on the SP site object that you could use to just convert your site collection to a hostname site collection. In this case, we've got portal.old.contoso.com, and we're renaming it to portal.contoso.com, and we're converting it to a hostname site collection along the way. That is very convenient, because I never liked the backup restore. If you've got big site collections, that was a big hassle to convert to hostname site collections. Okay, let me show you how that's done. So I already created a site collection, a path-based site collection. So it's in my content web application /sites/migrate-me. What we are going to do now is we're going to take a reference to this site. We are going to have our new URL ready. It has to be a system.uri object. And then we're just going to rename our site. Okay, and if we then run our inventory script again, we will see that we went from, if everything went all right, from 2 path-based site collections to 1 path-based site collection. So we have only the root site collection left, and we converted the other one, to migrate-me.thvo.net. So you can even use this command to completely change the path of the site. And then you have to adapt your DNS too, of course. Okay, so that is all very simple. Switching to my deck is not simple. Okay. Some good practices. This is not a good practice, the first one. This is a requirement. Create an empty root site collection as a path-based site collection. Create your my site host. Don't forget that, as a hostname site collection. You might have to develop a custom site creation provider. That's the SP site creation provider object that you have to extend. Although you can, don't mix and match path-based and hostname site collection in the same web application. You could do that, but I wouldn't recommend that. Hostname site collections are great, but there are some things that you have to be aware of, especially the surrounding infrastructure, let's say, like DNS records, ADFS entries. If you let your users create hostname site collections and they create hostname site collections all the time, well, don't forget to create records in DNS, for example. You probably would want to have some kind of provisioning mechanism that when a user creates a hostname site collection, that a DNS record is created or something like that. Or a relying party in ADFS is configured, something like that. So that is something that you want to do. Don't forget your certificates. Wildcard SAN certificates, it's sometimes hard to get them. It's sometimes a fight with your security guys, but for hostname site collections, that is basically the only way. You can use the custom provisioning code that I showed you. And be aware of the feature scope. If you have features that are developed for you, because we are using only one single web application, depends on the feature scope, what people can do in their different site collections. Single web application also means a single web config. So if you specify specific settings in your web config, that setting is valid for all site collections now. Something very special also, DTAP stories, so moving from development to test, acceptance, and production. If you use path-based site collections, the URL of the site is in the configuration database. And you can just detach a content database, move it from development to test or to production, attach it to a web application with a completely other URL, and you could use it. But with a hostname site collection, the site collection URL is not in the configuration database, it is in the content database. So when you move it to another location, to another farm, well, you have to probably change the URL of these site collections, because otherwise you cannot use them, because DNS is DNS, so it's pointing to only one location. That's something to be aware of. That's a nice real-world tip there. I just have a few minutes to touch on some advanced topics, and that's mainly reverse proxying and SSL offloading. Traditionally, we used alternate access mappings to do SSL offloading. Now, I must say, I don't see many customers who, well, I see customers who use SSL offloading, but not many new customers use SSL offloading. First, I don't know why, but people don't like to use it anymore, at least not my customers. But still, it's a very, very valid approach. So it terminates the SSL request outside of SharePoint, so on the load balancer or on the reverse proxy, for example. Now, with path-based site collections, you use alternate access mappings. So your request from the user ended up on the load balancer or the reverse proxy, and then the reverse proxy, that device sent the request with HTTP to your SharePoint. And then with the public URL, SharePoint answers with the HTTPS request so users can use HTTPS. If you want to use this approach with hostname site collections, your device has to support a custom HTTP header. And that is front-end HTTPS only. It's the same one that is used by Outlook Web Access, by the way. So that means that a request goes to your reverse proxy or your load balancer, which HTTPS. SharePoint then the device forwards the request to SharePoint, and SharePoint will determine, based on this HTTP header, if it will reply in the request with HTTP or HTTPS. That's how it knows that it's using SSL offloading. So it's a completely different approach than for the traditional path-based site collections. So yeah, you need a web app that listens on port 80. I think that's self-evident because we're using SSL offloading. And you don't need alternate access mappings anymore. Okay. Now the protocol used for a hostname site collection depends on the URL that was used to create it. So if you create a site collection with HTTPS, it will be HTTPS. Finally, using multiple web applications with hostname site collections, you can do that, but it's not recommended. Then you use multiple IP addresses because you've got multiple web applications without a host header. Okay, I guess we're out of time. If you still have questions, I'm here for the rest of the conference. So if you've got questions, don't hesitate to come to me and ask them. So as summary, keep it simple. Don't try to architect those 30 web applications and 30 application pools, is hostname site collections, although it's stated on TechNet, is not the holy grail. There are still some gaps, many gaps. You need some custom development probably. You have to understand the relationship between IAS and SharePoint. And in my opinion, it's more ideal for greenfield projects, but I like it a lot, so, and I hope you will try them. Thank you.